Welcome, traveler. You've chosen to drift back, not merely through centuries, but through memory itself. Before we begin, find the position that invites stillness. Head easy upon the pillow, hands resting where they fall. Let your jaw loosen. Let the breath become long and unmeasured. As you listen, do not chase every word. Allow the sentences to pass like waves, each one lifting you, then leaving you softer than before. If your thoughts wander, they are already doing what the sea does, moving outward and returning gentle. In this hour, the story is not a lecture, it is a tide. And by the time the tide withdraws, sleep will have arrived. Now, close your eyes. Let us travel to the Western Ocean, to the legend that has outlived empires and whispered to philosophers, sailors, and dreamers alike. Let us seek Atlantis. More than 2,000 years ago, the philosopher Plato wrote of a powerful island nation that thrived beyond the pillars of Heracles, the straits now called Gibraltar. He recorded it in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, claiming his story came from Egyptian priests who told it to Solon, the wise lawgiver of Athens, generations before him. They spoke of an empire vast and ordered, ruled by kings descended from the sea god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. Poseidon, they said, shaped a mountain rising from the heart of the island into concentric circles, land and water alternating like ripples frozen in time. Upon those rings he built his palace of white, black, and red stone. Around it, he raised walls sheathed in shining bronze and the purest orichalcum. Atlantis, they said, was blessed with every gift. Fertile plains rich with crops, forests filled with wild beasts, mines yielding metals unknown elsewhere. Its engineers channeled the sea itself into perfect harbors. Its sailors crossed the known world. At its peak, Atlantis commanded lands as far as Libya and Tyrrhenia, the old Mediterranean shores. Plato's words were never meant as geography alone. They were a lesson, a mirror held to human ambition. For he said that when the Atlanteans grew proud and forgot the virtue of the gods, their splendor turned to vanity. And in a single day and night of misfortune, the island sank beneath the sea. Yet even in his warning, the image he painted was irresistible. A civilization so harmonious that even its fall sounded like a lullaby of water returning home. As historians, we trace fragments, hints in the Aegean, the Azores, perhaps Santorini, where the volcano of Thera once shattered a Bronze Age world. Each theory is a lantern, briefly lit and then extinguished. For the ocean keeps its secrets with kindness. Now, imagine Imagine yourself standing upon that mythical shore, long before the end, when the empire still breathed. The night is clear. The air carries salt and jasmine. Torches flicker along marble quays. Ships with high prows rock gently, their sails furled, their hulls painted with spirals of gold leaf. You begin to walk. The stones beneath your feet are warm from the day's sun. They are flecked with crushed shells that glimmer like stars under your steps. Ahead rise the city's rings, 3 great circles of sea and land, joined by bridges so perfectly arched they appear weightless. Water moves through channels carved smooth as glass. Each ring reflects the next, until the whole city seems an echo of itself. The outer ring hums with quiet life. Stalls of fruit and amber lamps, the murmur of merchants. But even here, voices are low, measured by the rhythm of the tide. In Atlantis, sound is a courtesy. Everything important can be said in a whisper. Crossing the first bridge, you feel a mild current beneath, a reminder that the ocean flows through every street, binding the city like breath through a body. On the second ring, the dwellings are larger, their walls coated with plaster tinted from local minerals. White for calm, red for strength, black for wisdom. Windows of translucent stone glow from within. Through them, you glimpse gardens where small fountains play music to themselves. The innermost ring is silence itself. Here stands the Temple of Poseidon, its columns higher than the masts of ships, its roof sheathed in silver that mirrors the stars. In the center burns a slow blue flame that has never been extinguished since the god first blessed the island. An old chronicler would tell you this flame the ground tilts slightly, and you realize you are no longer standing upon the ancient quay, but floating, your feet weightless, your body upheld by the same sea that once carried Atlantean ships. The rings of the city remain below, vast and shimmering, but they are no longer made of marble and bronze. They are made of coral and light. Schools of fish drift through the old colonnades, their scales flashing where once banners hung. Columns lean like tired giants resting. Sand moves in soft sighs where citizens once walked. You drift downward through curtains of light. The temple stands below, roof broken, blue flame long gone. Yet the marble glows from within, alive with plankton that pulse in time with the sea. Every ruin becomes a lantern. Inside what was once the Hall of Kings, seagrass waves like banners. Between two fallen columns lies a single stone disc, engraved with concentric circles, the emblem of Atlantis itself. You reach toward it, though your hand feels as light as thought. When your fingers brush the surface, the carving ripples outward, and for a moment you see the city as it was, full, golden, awake. Then the image softens again into water. You feel no loss, only release. The current carries you slowly upward. Through the haze of blue you glimpse the moon above, wreathed in silver. You rise toward it, as if sleep were a tide, and you its faithful swimmer. Each meter is a breath. Each breath is lighter than the last. You may let go now. If the mind wishes to picture the ruins glowing far below, let it. If it prefers darkness, the ocean has plenty to lend. The breath goes in and goes out, as surely as the tide against a hidden shore. With each exhale, another piece of the day slides away. Atlantis is quiet now. So are you. When the last word becomes indistinct, stay where you are. Let the story continue without you. The ocean will remember the rest. Morning in Atlantis arrived not as a command, but as a gentle agreement between the sea and the sun. The first light came from beneath the horizon, refracted through a thin veil of mist that always hovered over the central bay. The city glowed before it was even awake, its walls taking the colour of pearl, its waters the colour of quiet thought. The people stirred with unhurried purpose. There were no horns to call them to labour, no cries of urgency, only the measured rhythm of doors opening, of sandals against polished stone, of voices that began low and calm, as if each person remembered that sound travelled far across the canals and should move kindly. From the highest terrace of the middle ring, a clear view stretched to the far plains. The land was a patchwork of silver channels and emerald fields. Barley grew thick along the irrigated banks. Groves of olive, fig, and pomegranate dotted the hillsides. Herds of gentle beasts grazed under the watch of herders, who sang more for the animals than for themselves. It was said that the soil of Atlantis never refused a seed, that even the stones were generous if spoken to softly. Within the city, the air carried the mingled fragrances of cedar, citrus, and the faint sweetness of crushed flowers used to polish marble. Artisans were already at work, potters shaping vessels with spirals that echoed the city's own design, metal workers coaxing the impossible gleam of orichalcum into mirrors, cups, and ceremonial blades that had never tasted blood. located upon the outer ring, was a study in harmony. Each stall had its allotted space, no merchant shouting above another. Trade flowed as evenly as the tide. From every ship that entered the harbour, goods were lifted down by hand rather than pulley, so that each person might feel the weight of the world they exchanged. There were spices from far coasts, glass beads the colour of the deep sea, ivory carvings depicting fish and moons. Yet even amidst wealth, nothing appeared hurried or hungry. Possession in Atlantis was regarded as a kind of custodianship, a temporary stewardship of beauty. At the heart of the city stood the great temple, its steps worn smooth by generations of feet, yet gleaming still. Here the priests and philosophers met, not to command, but to listen, to the murmur of fountains, to the faint tremor of earth beneath, to the ocean beyond the walls. They taught that the world was a pattern of circles, every act a ripple, every soul a drop returning to the source. Children were brought to the temple gardens each new moon. They learned by imitation rather than rule. They were shown how to float a leaf upon water and watch the circles widen until they met the edge of the basin. This, their tutors would say, is what thought does. Therefore choose what thoughts you release. The lesson was never written. It was remembered in gestures and in the calm faces of grown men and women who had long ago watched the same leaf drift outward. Music was the second language of the city. Even the hum of workers polishing stone was considered part of a larger harmony. Instruments were few. Flutes carved from reed, drums stretched with fish skin, strings woven from the fibres of kelp. But their sound filled the courtyards at dusk, when light became liquid gold and everyone ceased their work. Families gathered on rooftops, speaking little, listening much. When a song ended, silence followed without embarrassment. In Atlantis, silence was applause. The architecture of the empire mirrored the geometry of the heavens. Every street curved gently toward the sea. Every doorway opened toward the prevailing wind, so that houses breathed as people did. The roofs were tiled with polished stone that caught moonlight as easily as daylight. In the cool hours before dawn, the city looked like a constellation fallen gently to earth, still unsure whether to remain or to rise back into the sky. At the outermost edge of the island, where the sea met the cliffs in slow deliberation, stood towers of observation. Within them, scholars kept watch over the heavens. They charted the wandering of stars and planets, comparing their courses with the tides. They believed, correctly, that the pull of the moon guided embodied both ocean and human feeling. To them, science and spirit were not rivals, but twins. Records were carved on thin plates of bronze stored within crystal vaults, each inscription a story of discovery or gratitude. When storms threatened, these vaults were sealed with wax and prayer. Thus even knowledge itself was treated as something alive, something to be protected tenderly. The kings of Atlantis, 10 brothers descended from Poseidon's line, governed not by decree, but by consensus. Each region of the island sent its representatives to the central hall every 9th year. There they renewed oaths written not on parchment, but spoken aloud, for the Atlanteans believed the breath to be sacred, carrying the same essence that stirred the waves. Disputes were resolved with patience, measured in hours of listening before the first word of response. No one ever left unheard. And yet, within the splendor, subtle change began, so small that at first it seemed merely a variation of tide. The population grew, trade expanded. Ships returned from foreign ports with tales of distant monarchs who ruled through fear and amassed treasure for display. Curiosity turned to admiration, admiration to imitation. Gold that once adorned temples now adorned garments. Mirrors meant for ritual became household vanity. The wise observed quietly, noting that the tone of music at dusk had shifted from reverence to performance. But still the city glittered, and glitter often disguises warning. There were festivals that lasted entire lunar cycles. The streets filled with floating lanterns, with dancers moving like waves, with tables spread from one ring to the next. The sea mirrored the revelry, scattering reflections that trembled into dawn. No one suspected that the sea itself might remember every step, every shout, every echo of pride. In the midst of this abundance lived artisans who still practiced the old simplicity. One was a woman named Thessa, a maker of mosaics. She worked in a small studio near the second canal, choosing stones of subdued hue rather than brilliant. When asked why, she replied, "Brightness is for the surface, depth is for the soul." Her work depicted not kings or battles, but the faces of fish, the spiral of shells, the slow bloom of sea flowers. People said her pieces looked alive, and perhaps they were, for each tile she laid with a breath of gratitude. Another was an astronomer called Leontes, who spent nights upon the cliff towers mapping constellations whose names have long since faded. He recorded a new star that appeared suddenly in the eastern sky, faint but unwavering, He wrote in his tablets, "When the sea reflects this star, Atlantis shall remember humility, or be reminded by sorrow." Few read his words. Fewer understood them. Beneath the city, tunnels carried fresh water from springs in the mountains. Some of these tunnels met the sea, creating a secret network where currents whispered stories of the world beyond. Children would sometimes drop petals into the inlets and watch them vanish, imagining them carried to unknown shores. The petals never returned. At sunset, the ocean turned glassy and gold, reflecting the city so perfectly that for an hour it seemed there were two Atlantises, one above, one below. It was a moment beloved by poets who wrote that the gods used that reflection as a mirror to examine their own creation. When night followed, torches and stars mingled until the difference blurred completely. The citizens believed that as long as that double image appeared each evening, the favor of Poseidon endured. Centuries of calm accumulated like layers of coral, each building upon the last. Generations forgot the early oaths. Temples were restored more for beauty than devotion. Philosophers still taught, but their students listened for rhetoric rather than wisdom. Wealth, once measured by generosity, began to be weighed in material. The inner flame of the temple burned lower, not for lack of oil, but for lack of reverence. Yet even as decline set roots, serenity remained on the surface. Travelers from lesser realms described Atlantis as a dream given shape. They wrote of streets so clean that one could see the stars reflected in the paving, of fountains whose water tasted faintly sweet with mineral blessings. They marveled at the absence of beggars, at the ease of every citizen's gait. No one thought to ask what price perfection demands. The island's natural wonders multiplied the illusion of divine favor. Mountains yielded crystal. Plains bore fruit year-round. Horses of pale silver ran wild across the northern meadows. Fishermen spoke of dolphins that guided their boats home, of whales that circled the harbour in gentle procession during festivals. The boundary between myth and life was thin, perhaps non-existent, but beneath the crust of serenity, the earth stirred. Tremors, slight at first, were felt in the deep night when most slept. Walls trembled just enough to wake the lightest sleepers. The next morning no cracks appeared, and the people dismissed the quiver as dream. Only the oldest priests, those who could still hear the pulse of the ocean in their veins, exchanged glances across the temple flame. They knew that nothing on earth, or beneath it, moves without memory. In those days, the seas around the island grew warmer. Currents shifted in ways no scholar could chart. The astronomers noted irregularities in the moon's pull. The tides no longer obeyed the old rhythm. Ships returning from distant voyages reported storms of strange pattern, lightning that glowed green against violet clouds. Yet commerce continued, for wealth dulls caution. One autumn evening, as the sun lowered through a haze of amber, Thessa the mosaicist climbed the highest terrace to watch the light fade. From there she saw the reflection of the city ripple in the bay, not with the usual grace, but with distortion, as if the sea itself were uneasy. The towers seemed to bend. The bridges wavered like images seen through tears. She whispered a prayer to Poseidon for balance, then turned home. No one else noticed, or if they did, they chose not to speak of it. Within the palace, the 10 kings gathered for their decennial council. They wore robes embroidered with the symbols of their provinces: waves, mountains, flames, winds. The meeting began in formality, but soon turned toward boasting. Each ruler recounted the monuments erected, the tributes collected, the fleets expanded. The oldest among them, Atlas himself, remained silent longest. When finally he spoke, his words were simple. When the sea is calm, we believe it loves us, but calm is its way of listening. The hall fell silent, then filled again with talk that did not heed him. Outside, the moon lifted full over the eastern horizon, pale gold upon the water. For a fleeting moment, it reflected perfectly in the central canal, forming a circle of light exactly aligned with the rings of the city. Scholars observing from the towers noted the coincidence with satisfaction. In their ledgers they wrote, "All omens favourable." Yet below the record, Leontes the astronomer added one quiet line: "Favour is not immunity." That night the winds shifted from the west. They blew with an edge of salt and cold that no season explained. The surf along the outer shore thickened with foam. Birds that usually nested in the cliffs took flight toward the mainland and did not return. Atlantis still glittered. Its canals still mirrored the moon. Its people still believed themselves blessed. But the ground beneath, which had always pulsed gently with the slow heartbeat of the world, began to change its rhythm. A pulse became a tremor, a murmur, too low for waking ears. The sea was remembering its own depth, and far below, in the molten heart of the island, the god of the deep turned in his sleep. The day that followed the silent, watchful night opened as if nothing in the world could change. Morning leaned over the city with its usual gentleness. Boats slipped across the canals. The aroma of bread rose from clay ovens. Schoolchildren traced circles in the dust with reeds. Yet beneath the ordinary, a thin seam of difference ran through everything, the way a hairline crack runs through glass. Almost invisible, yet present in every reflection. On the outer ring, fishermen spoke quietly as they untied their moorings. The water lay flat as always, but their lines behaved strangely, drawing sideways as if a slow current had turned within the harbour. They tested their knots twice, then pushed off with the small shrug of men who trust tides to correct themselves. In the market, a merchant lifted a jar from a shelf and felt it hum faintly in his hands. He blamed the memory of last night's wine and set it down more carefully than usual. A gardener paused with her watering jar tilted over a bed of mint and noticed the surface of the canal change from smooth to faintly stippled, from stippled back to glass, without a breath of wind. The council hall filled again with voices. The 10 kings stood beneath a frieze that showed the sea carrying the city like a cradle. Advisors spoke of tribute to be collected, of new quays to be built on the southern shore, of a proposal to plate the inner walls with sheets of orichalcum so bright that ships could find their bearings by their reflection at night. When someone questioned whether such glare would blind the eyes, another replied, "Then it will be known that our brightness cannot be faced." Laughter moved around the room like a polished cup being passed, handled by all and owned by none. Atlas listened, still and patient. When he raised his hand, the hall quieted, out of habit, if not out of longing to hear him. A city can be gilded until it forgets the wood beneath, he said. A face can be mirrored until it forgets the skin. When the tide turns, what will shine for us then? A younger king thanked him with courtesy and returned to the agenda. The scribe's reeds scratched. Resolves were recorded. The sea went on breathing. That afternoon, Leontes climbed the observation tower. He had slept little. He aligned his instruments, drew the positions of the moon and the wandering star he had marked weeks before, and found the angles altered by a hair's breadth that troubled him more than any storm. He watched the horizon. A dark band formed there, not a cloud, not a squall line, but a thickness in the air, as if the world itself had exhaled and not yet breathed in again. He wrote, "The sky holds something unsaid." In her studio, Thessa arranged tiles for a mosaic she had long avoided. A map of the city in rings, to be set into the floor of a public bathhouse on the middle ring. The commission had come with a generous purse and a precise instruction. More gold, more shine, more spectacle. She tipped her tray and let the warm-coloured tesserae slide into her palm. She set a few in place, then stopped. The pattern on the table shifted before her eyes. Where she had planned smooth arcs, she now saw small fractures, hair thin, like dry riverbeds across a plain. She rubbed her brow, then went to the canal and washed her hands in the cool water until her fingers steadied. When she returned, the lines were still there, faint, insistent, asking to be acknowledged. She set one dark tile among the light, a quiet record of that question. No one would notice, she thought, but she would know. A day passed, another followed. At first, the tremors came like a distant animal turning in sleep, felt by the very lightest sleepers and by the oldest beams in the oldest houses, forgotten by morning. Then they came in full waking, a brief shiver through the floor underfoot, a vibration in the cups on a shelf, a chain of tiny ripples spreading across a basin. People looked up, laughed softly, and pressed their palms to the walls as if feeling for a heartbeat. The priests poured oil into the sacred flame and told stories of earlier quivers that had passed without harm. The city's calm held, but now it was the calm of a hand laid flat upon a table to hide its trembling. On the fifth evening, the harbour did something no one had seen before. The tide withdrew farther than any elder recalled, bearing stones along the quay that had not seen air in living memory. Children ran to gather shells, calling to each other as they chased the retreating line. Dogs barked at the exposed rocks. The air smelled strongly of copper and brine. Then, without wind, without warning, the sea returned in a long, smooth rise, not as a breaking wave, but as a lifted sheet. It crossed the stones and lapped at the marketplace steps. It stilled there for a long breath, sighed, and withdrew again to its ordinary edge, as if testing the distance. Fishermen looked at one another and did not drop their eyes. That night, the moon sat low over the water and large, a coin held close to the face. Lanterns along the canals fluttered in odd rhythms, as if the breeze came from beneath rather than from the sky. The city did not sleep easily. Mothers kept their hands on their children's backs and counted breaths. Horses in the northern meadows gathered shoulder to shoulder and faced inland, then turned as one body and faced the sea. In the temple, the flame was trimmed to its smallest, and the oldest priest knelt beside it, his lips moving without sound. The council met by torchlight. Reports came of springs that had gone suddenly dry, and of others that had begun to run with a mineral tang. A farmer spoke of a line of heat rising from a furrow, shimmering the way air shimmers above a hearth. A navigator who had just returned from the mainland said the currents had betrayed him twice, first drawing him too far west, then refusing to carry him home until he released his cargo into the sea. The hall listened and weighed. The youngest king proposed a spectacle to reassure the people. Games upon the outer ring, music through the night, lights strung along every bridge. "We must show strength," he said. "Fear feeds on darkness." Atlas closed his eyes for a moment. "Fear also feeds on denial," he said. "We will honor the sea in the old way. We will be quiet." Morning came with a brightness too clear for comfort, as if the sun had drawn nearer to see. The air felt empty of birdsong. Work began late. People walked softer. At the hour when the market would ordinarily fill, voices gathered outside the temple instead. The priests stood upon the steps and spoke without drama. They reminded the city of the earliest oaths, not of conquest, not of display, but of balance. They asked for a day of stillness. No boats launched, no markets opened, no hammers lifted. "The world is speaking," the high priest said. "We will listen." The city obeyed, not from fear but from habit of reverence that even wealth had not erased. Doors stood open, courtyards filled with quiet. The canals lay unruffled, as if hoping to hear themselves. Children were kept near. The breeze, when it came, carried a cool sweetness from the mountains, as if the island were breathing inward. Toward midday, a sound rose from far below the floor of the world, deep and slow, like a chord struck on an instrument far larger than any made by human hands. Cups trembled. Tiles ticked against one another softly in their trays. Hair rose upon forearms. The sound did not frighten so much as hush. It faded. People exhaled. In that pause, Thessa left her studio and walked to the highest bridge. From its center she could see the three rings at once. The water in the channels had taken on a strange clarity, as if it were thinner, less dense. She could see the carved stones at the bottom, the bronze moorings, the pale fish sliding along the shade. Her eye caught a defect along the inner wall, a thin line creeping where there had been none. She followed it with her gaze and felt a pinch in her chest, not of panic, but of recognition, like seeing a loved one age between one look and the next. Leontes climbed the tower again and put his eye to the tube. The new star still burned where he had written it, but the air between it and his instrument warred gently with itself, shaking the pinpoint into a tiny, trembling flame. He lowered the tube and looked with his ordinary sight. The horizon wore the same dark band as before, but nearer now, as if the sea had drawn a hem up from its depths and held it uncertainly in its hands. A little after mid-afternoon, the first quake came. It did not leap or roar. It arrived like a slow animal, placing one foot upon the city, then another. Houses creaked. Water climbed the sides of basins and left smooth rings as it settled back. Cracks appeared in plaster with the neatness of drawn lines. A statue leaned and found a new balance. The quake departed the way it had come. The city took stock. People called to one another across courtyards, "Are you well?" and were answered, "We are." The high priest lifted oil to the flame. The oil trembled in the ladle and did not spill. An hour later, a second quake came, sharper. A balcony dropped, 1 finger's width. A cornerstone slipped and made dust. In the marketplace, a row of jars toppled and did not shatter, as if even the clay remembered kindness. The canal sloshed, then steadied. A man standing on the middle bridge leaned both hands on the rail and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw the sea had withdrawn again, beyond the ordinary reach, farther now, exposing a shining sweep of seabed, ridged and glistening, streaked with the dark paths of eels. People gathered. Some stepped onto the wet sand, startled by the softness underfoot. Shells lay open like small moons. Far out, the horizon looked higher than before, a low wall marching along the edge of the world. The sea returned, not as a collapse, not as a blow, but as a rising, steady and deliberate, over the exposed ground, across the stones, up the steps, into the street, then pausing as if to consider, and receding again, leaving the city damp and salted and wide-eyed. Mothers lifted their children and held them close enough that both heard the other's heart. The high priest lifted both hands to the air and spoke a blessing that had been used only twice in the memory of the oldest living, a thanksgiving for safe deliverance that admits danger without inviting it. At dusk, the council met once more. The chamber smelled of oil and damp plaster. Decisions were made swiftly now. Food stores to be moved inland, boats to be kept ready on the inland canals, fires to be quenched early, torches to be spaced at long intervals, not many, so that the city would be seen by any who needed to find their way, but would not flare like a challenge. The youngest king suggested closing the gates and posting armed men along the bridges. Against what enemy he could not say. Atlas shook his head. "There is no war," he said. "There is only listening, or not listening." The vote was taken. The gates remained open. Night rose, and with it a profound stillness. No music sounded from rooftops. The lamps that burned did so behind shutters. On the outermost shore, the towers kept watch in pairs. Leontes traced the path of the new star and stopped halfway. He had no word to write for what he felt. He drew instead a small circle on the tablet and left it unlabeled. Toward midnight, the earth spoke clearly. The sound had the depth of the first, the sharpness of the second, and a third quality neither had: persistence. It did not pass. It held. Floors shivered with a quick, tight movement that repeated, eased, repeated again. A doorframe sighed and straightened. A lintel dropped the span of a fingernail and stayed there. In the temple, the flame guttered and recovered, then settled to a point so small that the priest's breath could have put it out. He did not breathe through a count of 20. It lived. The sea withdrew again. This time no one followed it. People watched from the bridges and the quays, quiet as stones. The exposed ground shone in the moonlight like the back of some immense, sleeping creature. Far out, beyond the furthest rock, a low shape formed along the horizon. It grew slowly, steadily, as if kneaded upward by the unseen hand of the deep. It did not curl. It did not break. It was a gradual heave that raised the level of the world itself. When it came to the harbour mouth, the rise met the city's geometry and found no purchase for violence. It spread and thinned, climbed the banks and the steps, and the streets with a reach as patient as the making of a statue. It paused within the first rings, washed the stones clean of dust, and moved back. A child laughed once, a startled, involuntary sound at the feel of water on the toes, and was hushed softly, kindly, by a mother whose hand did not shake. The hour after midnight was the gentlest of all. The quakes lessened, the canals lay smooth, the lamps burned steadily. A person passing through the city might have believed the danger over. On the high terrace, Thessa stood beside her mosaic, wrapped in a shawl against the cool air, and listened to the quiet with tears that did not fall. On the tower, Leontes leaned into the wind, eyes closed, as if scent might tell him what sight could not. Close to dawn, the sound changed. It came first as the faintest rumour from the mountain's heart. A hollow knocking, irregular, as if two stones far below had begun to speak to one another. The knocking quickened and merged into a roll. The roll into a continuous long tone that carried through stone and wood and burn. The city woke fully without needing to be called. From the northern heights, a red glow appeared where no fires burned. It rose behind the ridge and bled into the dark like light through closed eyelids. Birds that had been silent lifted in a single band and flew out to sea, then wheeled and flew inland, then broke apart as if the air itself were confused. The first true heave of earth arrived as the horizon paled. It was not a tremor or a shiver. It was a lifting and a dropping, a taking away of weight and a pressing back of weight that emptied the knees and filled the eyes with stars. Walls leaned and returned, leaned and did not quite return. Bridges rang. The rings of water slopped against their stone boundaries and climbed them in ragged hands before falling back. A single column on the temple's portico let out a noise like a sigh made of stone, and lowered itself by the width of a palm onto its base, cracking the carved flower beneath. People knelt, not from worship, but from balance. Hands found hands. The high priest raised his voice for the first time in many years, and it sounded like a father calling children home across a field. Quietly, he said. Quietly. Then the sea gathered itself, not as a wave shaped by wind, but as a body moved by the floor that held it. It rose at the harbour mouth and moved inward with purpose. It climbed the outer ring and entered the market. It lifted carts and set them down in new places. It pushed a small boat into a street and left it there a suggestion. It filled the channels and lifted the moorings and made the city a little lighter. When it drew back, it took nothing that could not be replaced. For a brief, merciful hour, the motions eased. The glow in the north dimmed. The ground rested. Atlantis breathed. In that hour, Atlas called the council one last time. They met on the steps of the temple because halls felt wrong now. Too enclosed, too sure of themselves. He spoke plainly. "We cannot command what holds us," he said. "We can only honor it. We will move the stores up the slopes. We will keep the bridges open. We will place small boats along every street that loves the water too much. We will send no signal of panic. We will meet whatever comes with order and with quiet." He turned to the oldest priest. "Say the words," he said. The priest nodded and recited the vow made by the first kings, that strength serves balance, that wealth serves beauty, that life serves gratitude. The people repeated the vow, and the repetition steadied them. It did not promise safety, it promised presence. The sky began to lighten behind a veil of thin cloud. The eastern horizon smudged into pearl. For a heartbeat, the city looked as it always had on mornings of festival. Damp stones shining, faces lifted, hope moving among the people like a breeze. Thessa looked at her mosaic and saw the lines she had set in secret, and knew they had been true. The aunties looked at the star that stubbornly held its post even as dawn rose, and felt both humbled and strangely relieved. What is beyond us remained beyond us, and that is also mercy. Then the mountain spoke in full. The sound had no pitch. It was all pitches. It had no direction. It was every direction. The ground heaved in a long, rolling motion that began nowhere and everywhere at once. The temple's inner floor lifted, cracked, settled as two separate planes that disagreed by a finger's breadth. The central canal bulged and poured silver over its banks. The inner walls of the ring shook dust from their crowns like dogs shaking water. A scent of iron and warm stone filled the air. Along the outer shore, the cliff face changed shape, not by falling but by softening, as if it had been warmed and pressed by a hand. A new seam opened from the foothills to the water with the neatness of a mouth unclosing to speak. Steam slipped from it, first wisps, then veils, then a low, steady exhalation that tasted of hidden fires. People did not run. They moved with the purpose of those who have chosen their actions ahead of time. Mothers gathered children and stepped to higher streets. Men lifted grain jars to shoulders and carried them inland. Sailors loosed moorings and guided their vessels into the inner channels. The city adjusted itself like a sleeper rolling to the safe side of the bed. Atlas stood on the temple steps and watched as stones he had seen laid with his own hands found new beds. He placed his palm upon the column that had lowered and felt it vibrate like a living thing. "Forgive us," he said. "Not to the column, not to the sea, not to any god he could name, but to the balance itself. We forgot." The earth heaved again, stronger. A section of the outer ring's wall leaned outward, thought better of it, and stayed where it was. The middle ring's key developed a long, shallow wave in its surface that made carts roll without touch. The harbour mouth widened by the span of a ship. Through the widening, the sea drew breath. Dawn broke. The first light touched the water and found it no longer calm. Far out, the ocean drew back with determination, as if gathering strength for a single, unarguable sentence. The exposed floor of the world glistened. Fishes flapped and found their way to pools. The city stood, braced, silent. The sentence had not yet been spoken. It gathered in the lungs of the sea. It waited, patient as truth. And Atlantis, bright and ordered and full of human hearts, waited with it, listening to the breath that would decide the shape of the next hour and all the hours after. The breath came. The sea exhaled. It began far from shore, where the water thickened into a rising wall that curved inward on itself, silent at first, then roaring as the air broke from its crest. The line of it ran the whole horizon, an unrolled scroll of motion. To those on the terraces it looked less like a wave than like the horizon deciding to move. When it reached the widening mouth of the harbour, the sound filled every hollow space in the island, every cup, every ear. Birds lifted and were snatched away. The air tasted of salt so pure it burned. People drew breath together once, a single intake shared by the city. Then the sea arrived. It entered not as destruction, but as return. It poured into the canals and over the bridges, and through the markets with the calm authority of something reclaiming its own reflection. Walls bowed, roofs folded, columns leaned, found water instead of ground, and sank like candles lowering their flames. The sound was everywhere, a low, endless tone that made words impossible and unnecessary. Thessa felt it first as weightlessness. One moment she was holding the edge of her mosaic. The next she was within the same pattern she had drawn. Circles of light, rings of motion, The stones she had laid rose past her in slow spirals, glimmering like scaled creatures, then settled again below. For an instant, she thought she heard the click of each tile finding its final place. Then there was only the hush of depth. Leontes saw the wave crest against the tower and understood its height only when it blotted out the sky. He stepped to the parapet and looked straight into its moving blue. For a heartbeat, he saw within it everything he had ever charted: stars, currents, the curved paths of planets, drawn together and rolling toward him. He smiled, closed his eyes, and felt the air lift from under his feet, as if the sky itself had chosen to carry him. The temple flame went out without smoke. The oil lamps in the houses went out without protest. The sound of the wave became the sound of breath held and released on a vast scale. And then even that sound folded into silence. When the sea had finished speaking, no one remained to answer. The island was gone. The mountain's spine sank. The plain folded over it, and the water met above in a single closing gesture. Foam spread, curled, and disappeared. The horizon smoothed itself as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Only debris drifted for a while. A roof beam, a fruit basket, a strip of cloth embroidered with concentric rings. Then the tide gathered those too and drew them down. The morning light crossed an empty surface. The sea was blank again. Years became decades. Decades, centuries. Currents swept over the place where the city had been. Sand settled in layers that remembered nothing and yet held every shape. Coral found the bronze walls and made homes of them. Fishes traced the lines of old streets. Anemones opened and closed where once doors had swung. Atlantis did not die. It changed its vocabulary. What had been marble became limestone. What had been sound became rhythm. What had been promise became echo. The gods, if they ever looked down, saw not loss but translation. Order returned to the element that had inspired it. Above, civilizations came and went. Sailors crossing that stretch of ocean sometimes felt a trembling in the compass, a thickening of light on the water, a whisper through the hull. Plato would one day write of the island as memory passed through many tongues, calling it both a warning and a dream. He would end his dialogue unfinished, as if some part of him had drowned mid-sentence. The world would argue over truth and fable, over maps and coordinates, and in every argument the sea would listen, saying nothing, content to keep what it had taken. Far below, beneath the pressure and the green half-light, the city still existed in its own way. The rings had collapsed inward and hardened into terraces of coral. The palace walls gleamed with the slow fire of minerals. Seagrass covered the streets like carpets woven by time. Where the temple had stood, a vent in the rock released a ribbon of warm water that spiraled upward in perpetual offering. Small fish hovered in the column as if in prayer. Thessa's mosaic lay face up on the ocean floor, untouched by currents. The dark line she had placed among the gold remained visible, a thin reminder that even in perfection there had been foreknowledge. Over the years, light from the surface found it, scattered through the shifting layers of water, and made it glow faintly. When whales passed above, their calls vibrated through the stone and made the tiles ring in harmonies no human ear would ever measure. Leontes' tablets dissolved long ago, but the circle he drew without a name was preserved in another form, a whirlpool that forms each spring above the site, gentle and round, visible only when the moon is full. Fishermen who notice it steer wide, not from fear, but from respect. They say the current there sings, and if you listen with your head in the water, you can hear the low hum of a bell. It is not a warning, it is a lullaby. And so the lost empire became not ruin, but rhythm. Every tide that moves through that part of the world carries a fraction of its geometry. Every breaking wave on distant shores carries a trace of its lesson. Even in sleep, when we dream of cities half remembered, built of light and circles, we are hearing Atlantis breathe. Now the story softens. The centuries drift away like silt. You, listener, remain, floating above the calm, the water holding you without effort. The world below is quiet and complete. The air around you is cool and forgiving. In its cradle, the sea repeats a single phrase without words. All returns, all rests, all is well. The breath you draw is the tide drawing in. The breath you release is the tide going out. You belong to both. Let them meet in the middle. Let them close over you as gently as sleep closing over thought. Atlantis is beneath you, not lost but resting. You are above it, not searching but drifting. Between the two lies peace, and as the last trace of the story ebbs away, there is nothing left to do, nothing left to know. Only the endless, quiet pulse of the ocean and the steady, easy rhythm of your own heart, keeping time with the sea. And now, our journey ends. The waves are calm again, the story complete. Atlantis rests beneath the surface, quiet, eternal, at peace. Let your mind settle the same way. There's nowhere else to be, nothing left to do. You are safe, you are warm, and you are exactly where you need to be. Take one last slow breath in and let it go. Let the sea carry the last of your thoughts away. Let your body sink deeper into comfort. The world can wait until morning. For now, drift, float, sleep. Good night, dreamer. May your dreams be calm, and may the tides bring you home again.